Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Basil Smikle. I am a professor of practice and director of the nonprofit management program in the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. I know that some folks are still filtering in, so we'll give that a second. But welcome and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us for our second wonderful lunch webinar. Again, my name is Basil Smikle. I am the professor of practice and director of the nonprofit management program here at Columbia University's School of Professional Studies. I want to thank Lonnie and Andy, who have been fantastic in putting these webinars together. They are part of an incredible staff at the School of Professional Studies, and Lonnie specifically in nonprofit management. And I want to again thank them for their thank them for their partnership in all that is done for you, the students, and for our stakeholders in the community. Lonnie is going to come back at the end and share any announcements that we have about our future projects and programs. But today I want to introduce all of you to I call myself an old so-and-so, but you know, it really just means that I've had this professional career for quite a while, and one of the first people that I met in government is Rich Baum, who is with us today. Rich is the president and CEO of Educational Alliance. I had the opportunity to be on a panel with Rich, who was moderating a few weeks ago, pre-2024 presidential election. I need to go back and figure out if we were all right about that. But, you know, I'm so glad and thankful that when I asked, I thought it would be a good opportunity to hear from Rich, not about the presidential election per se, although we may get to that, but just about the work that he does at Educational Alliance and his career trajectory and the things he looks forward to doing in his job. So, Rich, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start. Really, I'm going to be like the actor's studio, right? I'm going to begin at the beginning. Well, why don't you just tell us what is the Educational Alliance? How long have you been here? What's your role? Tell us about the program, about the organization.
So I guess most broadly, Educational Alliance is a large social service provider focused on Lower Manhattan, south of 14th Street. Budget is $50 million roughly, about 600 employees. The history kind of colors what we are. We were founded a little more than 135 years ago. We were the second settlement house in New York City. I'm sitting right now in the original settlement house building. It's where my office is. You know, its original purpose, it was founded as a Jewish institution, and the purpose was to settle the tens of thousands of Jewish immigrants who at the time were pouring into the Lower East Side. It was I would say the primary, but one of the primary Jewish nonprofits founded at the end of the 19th century by wealthy, mostly German Jewish uptown individuals who were concerned with the crisis, what was seen at the time as a crisis on the Lower East Side. It's actually strangely resonant with what we're hearing now in New York, that the immigrants were seen as dangerous. People wanted them back out. The Lower East Side was considered the most dangerous community in America. And the Jewish immigrants were kind of at the core of it. And the Jewish immigrant families that had been there for really a generation or two sort of stepped up and founded us. For the first part of its history, it was solely focused on dealing with the immigration wave that was ongoing really through World War II. I guess it was largely a Jewish-focused charity through then. As the neighborhood changed post-World War II, Educational Alliance stayed focused on the neighborhood, which meant both Jewish community, but then a lot of other communities in need on the Lower East Side, and then more broadly throughout Lower Manhattan. So if I had to explain kind of the mission, the original mission was that settlement. The way I explain it more broadly now is that it's always been focused on the idea of human flourishing, that every person should be able to thrive. There are elements of emergency aid from the beginning, clothes, food, things like that, but it was kind of intrinsic to the settlement movement and the kind of perspective of the organization's founders that no matter how poor and desperate you are, they wanted to set you up for your fullest potential as a productivity, happiness, spirituality, whatever that is. So they had a very kind of forward-looking agenda of kind of for the time of kind of health, education, community, leisure, the arts, and like all of those things being what everyone should have. Um, just it's symbolic of that. One little piece is right after they founded the organization, they founded an art school in the organization because they believed not even, but they believed a poor person coming off the boat from Lithuania with nothing still could have talent, still should have an aesthetic experience. And that kind of thing is woven throughout the organization. So at this point, um, our core of, we have a core of four basic community centers and / programs. There's the settlement house I work in, which is as I said, a large social service provider for the Lower East Side neighborhood. Lower East Side still not as desperate as it was in the 1890s, but it's still a lot of people with a lot of challenges here, a lot of poverty, a lot of people in difficult situations. It's gentrified somewhat, but not remotely such that this is a neighborhood that doesn't need our assistance. In addition to that, we run the 14th Street Y, which is a Jewish community center in the East Village, which serves both as a Jewish community center, but also more generally as a community center for everybody. We run the Center for Wellness and Recovery in Alphabet City on Avenue D, which is a rough neighborhood, a complicated, rough neighborhood, and that's an addiction recovery center. About 100 people are living in it at any one time, and there are thousands of outpatients who rely on it for addiction recovery. Some people are there by choice, some people by court order, but it's a very forward-looking, really interesting place. And then we run after school and community school programs in about 7 schools in Lower Manhattan, high need schools. The defining principle I'd say in all of them is they're all operating through community. They're all about sort of the original settlement house impulse of bringing people together in one place and finding ways to help them together.
So you've had an amazing career to get to this point. Talk to us about what's your origin story?
So I was raised in upstate New York, or you call it the Hudson Valley or upstate. It depends how you regard upstate. My family were dairy farmers and cattle dealers. They were something that doesn't really exist anymore in that part of the state, which is they were just middle-class farmers. They weren't particularly wealthy, but they weren't, living in poverty. They had cows, and that was the business. And it was myself, my cousins, it was a lot of different people. There's a community in the Southern Catskills of German Jewish dairy farmers who had come over from Germany. That's what they'd done for, I'm sure, centuries in Germany, and then restarted it in the US. Excuse me. I went to Cornell, graduating with a history degree. Maybe many of you will be sympathetic to this. I had no way to utilize that history degree. Came home and continued farming, which wasn't my plan. And in a desire just to, I don't know what the right word is, diversify or do something other than farming, which I fundamentally found too hard and basically didn't enjoy. I ran for office for the county legislature, and I was allowed to run because I was running against the Republican leader of the legislature and surprised myself and others winning. And then I was elected minority leader of the Democrats in the county legislature. And for those of you from upstate, as Basil knows, the counties are one of the main organs of government in the state. So I led the Democratic opposition in the legislature for 4 years. It was a great, amazing experience. And it was great because I could farm during the day and do the legislature at other times. It was just an amazing formative experience for me to be that involved in local politics. Then I ran for county executive, which is kind of president of the county, and lost that. At that point, I thought I was either going to double down and be living in the Catskills for the rest of my life or leave. Um, I'd met a guy running for attorney general who was looking for votes in the state Democratic Party, named Elliot Spitzer. And I went to work for him. I was probably his second employee on his campaign for attorney general, his second campaign. He won. I became his chief of staff when he was attorney general and served as his chief of staff for 7 years. Then he ran for governor. I oversaw his campaign for governor. Then I was what's called secretary to the governor when he was governor. Probably the really amounts to chief of staff, but it's called secretary of the governor. And then he was involved in a scandal that required him to depart. And then this is where I entered nonprofit world. Um, I was friendly with a man named John Sexton, who was the head of NYU and president of NYU, and he was also chair of the New York Academy of Sciences, which is a very old, one of the oldest scientific academies in this country. Thomas Jefferson was a member. Charles Darwin was a member. So he hired me to be COO of the New York Academy of Sciences, which was, I guess, financially troubled, had some troublesome governance issues, but did that for 3 years. Then I went over to be John Sexton's chief of staff at NYU, another much larger nonprofit. And then John's term as president of NYU left, and the new president came. I thought I was going to leave, but I stayed for 3 months, and we really got along and hit it off. Andy Hamilton was president for the next 7 years. I was his chief of staff. And then I was kind of getting a little tired of it. COVID happened. I stayed during COVID. I was in charge of the COVID response at NYU. And at that point, I thought, sort of similar to my feelings about where I grew up, either I was staying at NYU for the rest of my life or moving on. And it was great. I loved higher ed, but I also felt a little bit like I don't have a PhD. I'm not a professor. And my original impulse was towards I was in government because of my personal feelings about social justice and community and how people should be treated, and higher ed intersected with that kind of, but didn't quite feel like what I wanted. I saw this job open to be CEO of Education Alliance. I always loved settlement houses, and I really wanted to be in the environment of direct assistance to people. I love politics and government and all those things and facing big issues, but I also started to feel that it both makes a difference, but I wanted to try and do direct assistance to like make a direct difference in people's lives. And this place felt like exactly what I'd always wanted, that it big enough to matter, complicated enough to be interesting, versatile enough that it could sort of be shaped to be, responsive to the needs in the community. And I was hired, and I've been here for about a year and 5 months.
Oh, well. I mean, it's an incredible story, and I want to. By the way, for those that have joined us to listen into this conversation, you are more than welcome to submit questions to us. There's a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. Feel free to put a question into the Q&A window, and we should be able to get to it in our time. But I wanted to talk to you about something you just said, because you talked about kind of the intersection of politics and government. Do you see yourself having to rely on that prior experience and your knowledge of sort of how things work politically, how things work in government, to be able to kind of do your day-to-day job?
In this job, yeah, definitely. I mean, half of our budget is city contracts. Half our revenue comes from the city. So we're constantly interfacing with city agencies and city priorities. And, we think about them much more than they think about us. But just the direction of the government matters a lot to us. And kind of trying to see around the corner with where the city's going, what they're likely to do, what they're expecting from us, how to respond, is definitely a part of the job.
And you hire people to do that, or is that something that you
I mean,
kind of take on?
I mean, there are people on the staff here who are certainly equipped to do it. So the chief program officer who oversees the programs was the deputy commissioner for social services for a number of years. So there's people here aside from me with experience in government. I think there's several people. Our chief policy person was in the controller's office for a number of years. So I'm not the only person thinking about those things, but there's no lobbyist, and there's no like intergovernmental staff like you have in government. Nonprofits almost never have the kind of bandwidth for that kind of thing. There's always, I'd love to have a chief of staff, but every time I think, I'd be like a superhero with a chief of staff. There's some need here and I can't bear to hire someone for me.
Right.
But it's the same thing with like government affairs staff. There's never a time when there would be like, yeah, let's do the government affairs person instead of feed some more people.
Right. And going back to that interaction, that interaction with government, what is it that they look for when you interact with them? Like, what do you report? Are you constantly reporting your metrics and results? Like, what is there a
Yes.
secret sauce to what they're looking for?
It is, and it won't be that satisfying. I think they really, it's what's positive and negative. They're really looking for stability. What government doesn't want is a sidetrack, a contract that goes sideways, or an outbreak of God knows what, someone hitting someone, someone abusing someone, someone behaving inappropriately with somebody. So they're looking for solid partners. I think I wish they were also, in general, not commenting on any particular agency, looking for kind of innovation, that kind of thing. But that's actually not how it functions. I mean, government's amazing at scaling up, doing things in a monumental level, ranging from Social Security to things here in New York City, school lunches, things like that, anti-poverty programs, um, and government is built for stability and ensuring that tax dollars are used appropriately. To take the rhetoric you hear all the time. And so they kind of undervalue or place less value on like agility, which I think
Mm,
a lot of us would be. And part of my, not pitch, but when I talk to people about why this matters and like why this is different than government, why what we do is different from government, is we have that space to be agile when we need to. And it often depends on money and other things, but we have just that sense we're right here on the street. I'm not that far from the problem where I sit right now. Like I'm not the person delivering the meals, but I'm not that far from the person delivering the meals.
mm.
And we have that ability to sort of sense what's going on and pivot at times. So that's something I think we bring to the picture. The whole nonprofit social services sphere in the city brings to the picture that government on its own wouldn't naturally bring to it.
Oh, I mean, that's actually, I mean, that's a great answer because and as you talk about scale, I imagine the smaller nonprofits have a little difficulty trying to communicate that level of stability that you have, given that you've been around for so long and,
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
everybody kind of, there's a track record there, right?
Yeah.
And then what about transition, mayoral transitions or just going from, commissioner to commissioner? Like, how do you find
Yeah.
yourself having to keep explaining things over and over again?
Yeah, but that's okay. I mean, in a way, they're the customer. The government is looking for a service, and if you're the commissioner or if you're the deputy commissioner, your top priority is like this contract. Being very clear about what you want and making sure it's done properly. And so we just have to be responsive to that. We just, we have even though we don't have a government affairs staff, even though I don't have a chief of staff, there's all sorts of things we don't have. We have a research and evaluation staff because we know we need that for our contracts, right? And that's part of, at our scale, it's been one of our competitive advantages, I guess you'd call it. Not that I'm not competing with anybody, but
Right.
I know it's a useful aspect to us, to our partners, that we are able to show the metrics, that we are able to sort of look at how we're performing. So sure, we're always introducing ourselves to people, but also the cast of characters in the city doesn't change. Basil knows this, doesn't change that much. The mayor changes, commissioners change, go down one level below that. It changes, from administration somewhat, but there's a certain stability in the city government.
Now, there are two questions in our Q&A. I'll get to those and after I ask this question, which is, you mentioned that you have a budget of roughly 50 million, so a good chunk of that comes from the city, or about half of that comes from the city. How do you go about fundraising for the other half?
So just to, I'll answer that. The other half is composed of two things. One is we have a large fee for service budget, which is,
Mm,
we run the 14th Street Y. There's a very active pool and gym there. We run a day camp for 1,000 kids on Staten Island that has a lot of fees attached to it. There's actually gym in this building. So it's about 50% government contracts, it's very broad, 25% fee for service where people are paying for something like the day camp or the gym, and then about 25% development budget, just to give you the scope of it.
right.
And the question was, how do I raise money?
Yeah, like how you have I imagine you have a specific fundraiser or
Yes, yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
there's a development staff. Um, it's a complicated operation. There's a lot of things going on. If I had to divide it up very broadly, we have a very active portfolio with foundations and other, grantors. Again, I think a lot of them value us for kind of our stability and our kind of staying power, and that they've been with us for a long time and come to us when they have priorities, and we try and match up on those priorities. Um, that's some of that's a lot of that's writing essentially applications, but there really is, I learned in this job, more than the Academy of Sciences or at NYU for me. Um, we're to some of them, we're a major partner for really generations, and they want to know me, they want to talk to us, they want to talk about what we're hearing, they want us to hear what they're thinking, and it's great. And they are more able than government in some ways to kind of pivot and respond to current needs. So there's the foundations, then there's my board, which is a really good board, and they give, not, I would say an enormous amount, but they give us, a significant amount every year.
Is there a right or
Yeah,
raise requirement? Yeah.
there is. There's both they give every year, and then there's a gala, and many of them buy a table at the gala. I learned, the gala was completely new to me. I spent the month before the gala last year experiencing, like, if I had to rank my abilities, party planning would be about the dead last of my on my skill set. But I had to step up, and sort of there are people doing it here, but I definitely had to answer questions I hadn't been asked in the past about entrees and things like that. And so there's foundations, there's the board, and then there's individual giving, which is kind of, if you're in all of you, I'm sure have heard this, in the foundation world, everyone always wants to find the magic donors out there who just care about something and want to give. There's no process. They're not on your board. They just care about X, and they give funds for X. And we actually have a fairly robust small donor base in the largely based in the Jewish community in New York, where Education Alliance has a long history, and there's a lot of people, to the extent they think about their giving in the context of Jewish values or their own Jewishness. They see this as a place to express the kind of impulse to help people.
I'll go to one question. This is Donica. Please forgive me if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. Thank you for sharing your experience. Is there such a thing as an average day in the life of a chief of staff? What difference can that role bring? What difference can this role make to a nonprofit?
An average role in a chief of staff, or
Yeah, as a chief of staff.
well, I was actually kind of a chief of staff for a lot of people. I'm actually an expert on chiefs of staff, I think.
Right.
I guess I was chief of staff for Elliot Spitzer. Even when I was CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences, in some ways I was chief of staff to the president of the Academy of Sciences, and I was definitely chief of staff to John Sexton and Andy Hamilton. A lot of it fundamentally is, I guess what I'd say is, a chief of staff, you have to balance two basic things. One is being responsive to, you're not just like a personal assistant, but being responsive to what the organizational leader wants to do, but also not becoming just responsive and being an independent actor enough that you can shape things around the priorities of the organization's leader. And I'd say unsuccessful chiefs of staff don't balance that. Either you become just a personal assistant, which maybe that's what they want, but you're actually not helping push down into the organization the leader's priorities, or you become just kind of like you just want to be this kind of free agent managing the whole organization, and then you kind of lose touch with your leader, the leader. So putting that aside, I don't know if there's a typical day. When I was at NYU, I guess my days were balanced between like president focused work, like their schedule, that they're being well briefed, that I have meeting coverage for important meetings, that I'm looking forward to what they need to be doing as a semester. As you know, every semester has its own kind of rhythms. And then I spent a lot of time on their priorities and problems that they came up. Part of my function as chief of staff at NYU was like, if something went wrong, it was fundamentally my problem in the end. Not anything, but something that had an organizational implication. I was there to sort of catch it before the president had to deal with it personally.
And to that, right, to that point, I was about to ask you. So, and there's a good chunk of your job where you're a bit of a gatekeeper, right, to get the
Yeah.
stuff before it gets to your principal.
Right, right. No, I used to say to people, and when you wind up in my office, all is lost. It could have if it could have been solved elsewhere, it would have been solved. The reason it's here is because it's an incredibly impossible problem, and the last stop before it has to be dealt with by the president.
Brandon has a really good question. Deanie, I see your question as well, but that absolutely get to that. I'm kind of going to wait to ask that in a little bit. But Brandon is in many ways asking you to lean on your rural background. What advice will you offer a new nonprofit in rural South Carolina working to incorporate a municipality for an underserved community, especially in a landscape where fundraising and local government support are limited? With data strongly supporting our mission, how can we best position ourselves to gain momentum and establish meaningful partnerships? Interesting question.
I have an answer to that question. I think well, I don't know anything about South Carolina. I've never been there, so I'll start with that. But when I started with this, I'll do a slightly longer way of answering. So I was in Orange County, then Elliott became Attorney General. And then, here's a guy from Manhattan. I mean, he'd been around the state campaigning, but his roots were obviously Manhattan, not upstate. And I started this thing where he would visit a community, and then I would schedule meetings, like a day of meetings, with the Farm Bureau, the head of the Kiwanis, the head of the volunteer firemen, the Chamber of Commerce. And I remember a good friend of mine in the office, Carl Andrews.
Oh my gosh, I remember Carl Andrews.
And I remember Carl, who was head of government affairs, saying,
Yeah.
"What are you doing? This is crazy. These meetings are so small." But I think he and Elliott really came around and thought they were valuable in the end, because the thing about rural areas is civil society really exists, and exists in the city too, in different ways. In the city, it's more unions and sort of larger scale, obviously, but at least in upstate New York, and I think probably safe bet in South Carolina, people find ways to come together, partially because they have to. They live separate, far away from each other, so they find ways to congregate. And it's just the society just has stronger roots there. People haven't moved as much typically. And finding those pieces of if there's one thing one of the things I took away from my time in local government was the power of civil society and the power of people joining and coming together. And I used really, even now where I am on the Lower East Side, I rely on that sort of background. And I think when you move into an area, understanding civil society and approaching it with humility as partners, instead of coming in and treating people as disaggregated atoms that just need help, is probably key.
I'll just tell a quick story to everybody. This is the moderator's privilege here. That when I was running the state Democratic Party, I went up to, and for most people that don't know New York State, they don't realize that it is a largely rural state. Once you get past, certainly past Westchester County, but as you start to go into Hudson Valley and beyond. And I was at an event at Yates County, which is in the Finger Lakes region. And it was on a farm. This is a Democratic event on a farm where all the neighbors came from, like 10 miles, 25 miles away. There's a huge event. And at the end of the event, you usually get party favors from a gala of some kind.
Sure.
They were giving out squash. And I was like, how is it? I'd never experienced that upon exit, you were shown, buckets of or baskets of squash and other produce. And I was amazed. I said, how do you do this? And he said to me, one of the farmers said to me, he's like, this is what we can't take to market. I said, why is that? It's perfectly good to eat, but it doesn't look right. It might not be shaped properly, so on, so it can't sell. And I said, well, what do you do with it? Said, sometimes we throw it out, sometimes we give it away. I said, this is a travesty. Why aren't there schools that are using this? Like, where are the partnerships,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And,
Sure.
But it's an amazing sort of, it's an amazing space to be in, because, as you said, it's family. There's such an incredible sort of ethos in terms of being in a rural community, and so it's amazing.
I always ask people, what is the largest membership organization in New York State outside of New York City? And the answer is volunteer firemen.
Yeah, that's right.
Every community, there's no paid firemen outside of the major cities in New York, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse. Every place else, mostly guys, maybe not, it used to always be only guys. I think it's changed somewhat, but it was, the firehouse was a clubhouse and they were also dedicated to protecting their community. And a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people.
Well, we have three good questions. So let me get to Dini was asking, what sort of situational planning or preparation did your organization do pre-election? And how do you think you will be responding in the next 4 years? What should nonprofit leaders be careful of and looking for? And I just want to add to that, many of you may have seen that the House passed H.R. 9495, which is a bill that it's actually stated as an anti-terrorism bill so that it would be able to take the tax exempt status from nonprofit organizations that were deemed to be engaged in terrorist activities. There has been some concern from organizations like the NAACP and others that it, under a broader description of that term and those terms, other organizations that perhaps may disagree with the administration's views may be targeted. I'm not going to ask you to talk about that, but I will ask you, the main part of the question, like, is there something about this new, this administration that presents a challenge or opportunity for you? How are you planning for that, thinking about it?
So we've definitely been thinking about it. One of our chief areas since our beginning is serving immigrants. And we definitely did a fair amount of work providing assistance to asylum seekers over the last year. It's part of our story and part of, our just what we do. And we still provide many of the services that developed in the late 1800s are still offered here today: language school, help filling out government forms, various other programs to provide assistance to immigrants. So we definitely have been thinking about that and how that could change and how the government could potentially come to us asking for information in the coming years. That's probably the chief one. The other, like everybody, the other big potential changes in funding. We run a large Head Start funded school, and Project 2025 zeroes out Head Start. Well, that I don't really think it'll be zeroed out, but I think there could be dramatic funding changes. A lot of our staff took the election very seriously. Like, this is a place, Settlement House, a place filled with people who are committed to their community, to social justice, to immigrants. I visited all our sites the morning after the election. I just thought they should hear from me as the leader of the organization, just to tell them we're the same place we were. We've been here a long time. The country's had peaks and valleys all along, done good things and bad things, and we're going to continue doing everything we can, within the bounds that we're able for the law and our funds. I think the next few years will be very complicated. I think with that bill, I haven't read the bill or the details of it. What that bill shows is that it's going to become harder to sort of stand back and say, hey, we're just helping people. There'll be more of a desire, more of a, choose sides kind of environment. I don't want us to define ourselves in terms of opposition. We're not a political actor. We can't be. We're 501(c)(3). We wouldn't be that if we wanted to be a political actor.
Right.
So, my view is we know what we stand for. We stand for community. We stand for allowing people to flourish. There's certain subsets to that: helping children, helping immigrants. I'm assuming the winds will be strong and we'll have to maintain our focus. And, there'll be times when people try and push us off that, but, we'll do what we can to stay with it.
But it's an interesting point too, that, in an era that's highly polarized, wherever you are on the political spectrum, that, if you're forced to take a side, what does that look like? Or what does that mean? Are you putting yourself into too much of a box when your work isn't exactly like that, right?
Right.
And,
I mean, look, my background was in partisan politics. Like, obviously, I ran for office. My campaign was not a positive campaign. When I ran myself, Elliot's campaign wasn't a positive campaign. Politics is about competition, contrast, and opposition often. And are somewhat the campaigns were somewhat positive. But my point is,
I know what you mean.
It wasn't like we ran on gardens and sunshine. Like, we ran on agenda. But that, I'm running a 501(c)(3) now, and you all know what that means. And the pressure will come from all sides, and I don't mean to equate them. The president,
Sure, no, of course.
his perspective. I don't agree with most of it, but he has his perspective. And then the people who want to be the resistance, and I'm, sympathetic with a lot of them, but we're not a political actor. I can't be.
Wow. Thank you for that. Kania, sorry again if I mispronounced your name. This question, thank you for sharing your experience. I'm a student in NYU currently, old stopping grounds, and wanted to ask, what were some of your biggest policy challenges under President Hamilton during early COVID at the NYU?
So COVID was an intense experience for me, really, like for all of us. Um, if you're at NYU, you'll be familiar. It's an extraordinarily decentralized place. I think somewhat like Columbia, but maybe even more so. It's dispersed in Lower Manhattan. The history of NYU is kind of professional schools coming together. So it's, there's a lot of, if I don't know what school you happen to be in, but the one thing I learned very early there, students at Stern feel like they're Stern students. Students at Tisch feel they're Tisch students. They know it's NYU, but a lot of people, their lives revolve around the school. When COVID hit, we felt, Andy and I felt, and the other people there felt we really had to centralize dramatically to protect the community there. It was a big culture shock for all my colleagues. It was a culture shock for me as the person at the center of it. Um, we were pretty tough and pretty dramatic in terms of what we did, sent everyone back, but when people returned, we ran a pretty tight ship in terms of what people were permitted to do and what the college experience was like for people. And I think, in some ways it was a great experience because there's a lot, I'm sure Basil and everyone knows there at Columbia, like a university environment's about critique and,
Mhm.
people not wanting to necessarily do what the leadership says. And it's a very dispersed environment. But actually I found people really did come together in that first year. Like really, I was surprised. Like a lot of my experience at NYU was faculty being mad at the president, which is like the ultimate dog bites man kind of story. Um, but at that time, I actually have a lot of memories of people who had been in other settings pretty tough on me and pretty tough on the president, really kind of trying hard, coming together.
Mm.
But it was a huge organizational problem, building access, vaccines, testing. It was a monumental organizational challenge, but in a way, an amazing experience and a frightening experience. Um, I remember when we were about to bring the students back and Columbia deciding not to and being worried, thinking like, oh my God, am I going to like poison Manhattan or something like
No,
that?
right.
And we didn't, but I was upset and scared at that point. And I remember we decided to do the sort of large scale testing. I said to someone, let's rent a tent because we don't want to do it in the buildings. And they'd say, well, the only tent we can find big enough is used for a circus. And I thought that, it's a really unusual world where I'm renting circus tents to deal with COVID, that, things had
Mm.
really gotten to a very unusual situation.
Um, Dan has a question. You mentioned staying power. Are there particular instances where Educational Alliance successfully pivoted to meet challenging priorities in the community while staying true to their values, or informative failures? I like the informative failures part.
I'll think about that for a second while I answer the first part. Um, Look, it pivoted in the mid 20th century from being an organization really solely meant for the Jewish community to an organization basically focused on helping anyone in this community, which included the Jewish community. So, I think it speaks to the values of the organization, that it believed in the value of every person and felt like it had a special something to offer to people who were speaking Yiddish, coming from certain countries, had certain religious norms, Jewish religious norms, but then ultimately decided its mission was helping everybody, being there for people in need. That's probably the biggest organizational pivot that happened in Educational Alliance's history. And my point isn't that it went away from like the Jewish element. It's a Jewish organization. Um, the board is not all but largely Jewish. It's funded by UJA partially. Um, but we believe our mission is to honor the kind of the each person's individuality and kind of existential value. Uh,
um, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
no, in terms of other pivots, I mean, it played a big role during 9/11 as a relief center. It played a
Mhm.
major role after Hurricane Sandy. During COVID, there was a lot of food and relief dollars and other materials given out from the sidewalk in front of Education Alliance. I think almost every disaster in the city's recent history, Education Alliance has played a very, very sizable role. If you're on the Lower East Side, it's a big, big building. Like not quite a spaceship landing in the neighborhood, but it's a very big building for a basically low rise neighborhood. And it's been a center of gravity whenever there's been a crisis.
You mentioned 9/11. And I just have to say, I think we met because I was thinking about it as you're talking about it. I think we met when Elliott ran. He ran against, was it Dennis Facco?
Yep.
In 1998, which was the
Yep.
year that Chuck Schumer ran and beat
Exactly.
Al D'Amato for Senate. And I remember Elliott's race wasn't decided that night because it was so tight.
A month later.
A month later, and were you with us? You were at the Waldorf Astoria that night, a hotel now that does not
Absolutely.
exist any longer.
Yeah.
But we were at the Waldorf Hotel. I was working for the borough president of Bronx, Freddie Ferrer, and Arnie Segarra was there, and a very, very nervous Elliott Spitzer waiting for the election results, but we didn't know for another month. But I also, going forward, I remember he was AG during 9/11.
Correct.
Yeah, and I was working for Senator Clinton at the time, and we tried to set up this thing where we wanted to work with all these nonprofits to be able to provide service and support to the families that were impacted, certainly the families of the victims. And I remember that was just an amazing time. Going back to an earlier question, when we thought of ourselves as a community, not just as Americans, but certainly as New Yorkers, how we were going to come together to really help and support each other. It was a really, really difficult time, but an amazing time in watching everybody
powerful time. There is one footnote to the story you're telling involving nonprofits, which is the Attorney General, as I'm sure many of you know, in New York State regulates nonprofits out of the Charities Bureau of the Attorney General's office. And it was only after I was there, I sort of realized the power of that part of the office and kind of the impact that it kind of really sets the parameters for charities, both by going after charities and kind of defining what constitutes violating their trust and kind of setting the overall parameters for charities in New York in some ways. But anyway, there was a big blow up at that time. You could look up, it was a fascinating issue. Red Cross raised huge money.
I remember that.
And kind of squandered it, or sort of basically they raised a lot of money and then sort of used it for I don't know how it developed. Some newspaper broke that fundamentally they were using it to cover their overhead to some extent. And the office really went after them and resulted in a settlement that sort of established a system for people to feel that they were donating directly to the 9/11 victims, to Red Cross and others, and kind of derailed them a little bit, but sort of ensured the money was going to the people who.
That's always important, right? To make sure it gets to the folks.
The ultimate, the gold standard, not even gold standard, the coin of the realm in nonprofits is donor intent, as I'm sure you all know. And they were not serving that purpose at the time. And the Charities Bureau played a major role in a very chaotic time in ensuring people could give money. I mean, it was a kind of environment people all over the world were giving money, millions of dollars, because they wanted to do something. And there was a real sense that all of a sudden it was being kind of diverted improperly.
So we'll get you out of here with the last question, Rich. This question comes from Matt, and I thought it was a good question to end on because it's the way I would want to end our discussion. What advice would you give to those entering the nonprofit world in their early careers? How could we make the most impact early in our path? That's a big question.
Yeah, I guess I'd say the most impact. I'd say it's a good idea to be humble in what you're willing to do early in your career, because you get experience. I think a lot of people everywhere I've been, a lot of people show up saying, I want to be one of the managers or the chief of staff or someone who's kind of doing the policy. But, you learn it from the bottom up, really. So I think in terms of that's more about advancement instead of impact. But I think in terms of building a career, I think it's important to enter with humility. In terms of impact, I think there's a lot of great nonprofits out there, really. I think, I guess another thing I'd say is there's a temptation to go to the blue chip places, and there's nothing wrong with the blue chip places. My guess is for all of you who have gone to a place like Columbia or to this institute and, have a real, bring a lot to the table, you probably have a higher impact going to the places that people haven't heard of or are more local. That just it's, I don't want to, that this will, I won't personalize it to Columbia. It's sort of like donating to Harvard. Like, it's a nice thing to do, but they really do have quite a bit of money. On the other hand, donating to, wherever, to some, community college will make an enormous difference. And, the people with talent who come in here really ripple throughout the organization. And we're not even that small, but we're not I don't know what, we're not some enormous famous charity. But the people with talent coming here really make a big difference and are felt throughout the organization. And I guess that's what I'd say is think about where you place yourself with your talent to not on how it sounds when you tell it to people, but the difference you'll make there.
Oh, that's a great way to end. Rich, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time and the thoughtfulness behind so many of your responses. I think a lot of I think our audience got a lot out of it today, particularly our prospective students, and to those prospective students that are on the call. Just know these are the leaders that we talk to and work with consistently, and we want you to be a part of our community. So we encourage you to apply. And on that note, Lonnie, who has been listening in, has one or two announcements that she'd like to bring forward.
Well, before Lonnie, I just want to say thank you for having me, Basil. It was a great
Thanks
conversation and
so
appreciate all
much,
the
my
work
friend.
you do in New York.